assistant professor of mathematics at Bryn Mawr College. She holds a bachelor's degree in mathematics from Bryn Mawr College and master's and doctoral degrees in mathematics from the University of Utah. Her research is in mathematical biology, and it focuses on applications to endocrinology and physiology. Professor Graham is a co-founder of the Mathematically Gifted and Black website, which in 2021 partnered with SIAM to create a new early career fellowship for historically excluded groups. She is committed to redefining mathematical and academic spaces with a vision towards inclusion and anti-racism. So just as a reminder, for the previous sessions, we've had all the talks be asked through Slido just so that they don't get lost in the chat. So feel free to sort of put comments and thoughts in the chat as the talk goes on, but if you have any questions specifically for Dr. Graham, if you could put those into the Slido, and there should be hopefully a link put to the Slido in the chat in a sec. And then just a reminder for after Dr. Graham's talk, we'll end sort of right on the hour or so, and then we'll go to breakout rooms. So Dr. Graham and I will go to one of the breakout rooms, and sort of the discussion will continue from there. Okay, so again, thank you so much, Dr. Graham, for speaking. The title of her talk is Mathematics, We Have a Problem.
Thank you so much for that introduction. So I wanted to get started with this talk of what the problem is by just sort of saying that, so earlier this year on January 6th to be exact, I gave an invited lecture at the joint math meetings titled Anti-Racism in Mathematics, Who, What, When, Where, Why, and How. And since that time, I've been told multiple times that the message that I shared then should be told and heard multiple times. And so even though the talk was recorded and is available on YouTube, I wanted to take some of the time today to reiterate some of the key points of my message from that time, and then also provide some additional thoughts on where I think graduate education fits into this broader theme. So to get started, simply put, mathematics, we have a problem. And our problem is not one that's, operating on a space shuttle on its way to sites unseen. It's something that is often seen, ignored, or even invalidated. And it's a problem whose solution remains to be elucidated. And I would like to believe that there's a solution to this open problem, and perhaps like the dedicated mathematicians that we are, we can keep chipping away at it in hopes of making progress. It permeates every aspect of mathematical culture as we know it, and like a weed, it will keep growing, blending seamlessly into the landscape unless we identify it and cut it out at the root. And in order to name this problem, we have to be willing to confront the honest truth, not just the one that helps us sleep better at night. We have to be willing to acknowledge our own complicity in perpetuating the problem and the harm we cause. And we also have to know that naming the problem is the least of our concerns. Call it what you will or don't, but know that an individual preference for nomenclature is irrelevant. Your actions, not your intentions, will dictate where you stand. And personally, I prefer to call it by name. So let's do that. It's racism, it's white supremacy culture, it's the settler colonialist mentality. You name it, we have it. And the mere fact that society is battling the existence of these very issues makes it so that the mathematical world experiences them too. We're not exempt. We don't exist in a bubble, much to the chagrin of the stereotypical mathematician who never seems to leave the building and is often scribbling furiously on some chalkboard somewhere or pacing back and forth for hours on end. The world is happening, and for many of us in the mathematical world, the consequences can mean the difference between life and death. So while I would like to be fairly certain that the extent to which each of us expresses a racist idea or behavior does not often come with fatal consequences, I want to also point out that racial abuse need not be physically violent to cause harm, because trauma in any form is violent. So I would also further caution against falling into the trap of believing that these two forms of violence are so different, because willful denial of racism and its role in shaping modern society in the US is precisely why blatant racial violence persists in the light of day. Our unwillingness to question and to analyze our own power and privilege in society actually sets the tone for what we value and devalue most. even in mathematics. And more so, the past few months have shown us that complacency is how things get worse. It's how anti-Asian violence, for example, which has existed in this country for more than a century, is given a green light. It's how that violence and continued violence against Black and Brown people gets relegated to someone else's problem. It's how we continue to separate injustice from inaction, when in reality, they are synonymous, and none of it is okay. So now that we have a name for the problem, we also need to hold ourselves accountable for devising ways of dismantling it. That is, for constructing a solution. And through anti-racist action, we are combating not only this pervasive culture that supports racist ideas, behavior, and policies, but we are also trying to dismantle it at the same time. So as Ibram Kendi alludes to, we need to get away from thinking that quote unquote not racist is a thing, because it isn't. According to Kendi, there is no such thing as a not racist policy, idea, or person, just an old-fashioned racist and a newfound denial. All policies, ideas, and people are either being racist or anti-racist. Racist policies yield racial inequity. Anti-racist policies yield racial equity. Racist ideas suggest racial hierarchy. Anti-racist ideas suggest racial equality. A racist is supporting racist policy or expressing a racist idea. An anti-racist is supporting anti-racist policy or expressing an anti-racist idea. A racist or anti-racist is not who we are, but what we are doing in the moment. So if we operate within this framework as mathematicians, we should make the large majority of what we do and think anti-racist. As Kendi also states, the only way to undo racism is to consistently identify and describe it and then dismantle it. And so in the context of graduate education, being anti-racist benefits all of our students, not just those from marginalized backgrounds. The sooner we realize this, the better off the future of mathematics will be. We need to move from the all too common experience of mathematics graduate programs as being a rite of passage through years of exploitation and emotional abuse to something better, something more inclusive, and something anti-racist. So as I discuss some of the important questions of anti-racism in mathematics, I also have a few requests. So I personally often tell my students to embrace the discomfort when attempting something new. In their case, it's usually coding, but I'm asking that you do the same here. So my goal is not to lecture you on how to be a human being, but rather to offer comments that help disrupt your reality for the greater good. And so as you prepare for this, I also ask that you be aware of your resistance and examine your defensiveness in the process. Because as James Baldwin said, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. So I want to begin by disrupting the notion that the mathematical world operates as a community, so to speak. Indeed, there are communities to be found within mathematics, but it is rather reductive to conclude that we all exist and persist within the same community, given the varied definitions of the word. So there are just a few definitions here, but I personally like the simple English Wikipedia definition, which is anything but simple in my eyes. It says that a group of living things sharing the same environment is what a community is. And in America, there is no possible way for all individuals to share the same environment. The environment in which we operate differentially affects each of us, and this extends to the mathematical environment. And as a microcosm of larger society, our collective environment, whether it's structural, social, or physical, is the very thing that separates us. And this problem that we have began as a structural one and has seeped into our very nature. Structural problems require structural solutions. But human beings in charge of putting these solutions in place must also undergo the internal work necessary to achieve large-scale and meaningful transformation. So where do we begin? We first need a representative description of what we mean by community when we consider the various members of the mathematical world, recognizing that what counts as community to some translates into elitism, exclusionary practice, racism, bias, and trauma to others, among other things. The other thing that we need to do is we need to acknowledge that mathematical culture is deeply entrenched in white supremacy culture. And we have to be willing to undertake the responsibility of dismantling that white supremacy culture in the spaces we navigate as mathematicians. And I, like many of my colleagues across the nation, am constantly trying to overcome the messages of white supremacy culture, which has been imposed on me personally in the math world, and also something that I've internalized since birth. How could I not? So although I could spend the entire talk on the ways in which white supremacy culture plays out in the mathematical context, I want to instead just sort of highlight some of these characteristics as examples. So again, in my view, mathematicians in a sort of self-explanatory sort of way often strive for perfection. Mathematicians often operate with a defensiveness of a power structure, whether that's in our classrooms or our societies or in our respective institutions and organizations. Mathematicians often adhere to an only one right way mentality, even if we try to believe that that's not the case. And due to underrepresentation in the overarching power structure, mathematicians can also be paternalistic. Mathematicians often by nature of the field have a tendency toward either or thinking rather than a both and mentality. Mathematicians often pride themselves on objectivity, which cannot actually exist given our humanhood. And in positions of power, privilege, and difference, mathematicians may believe that they have a right to comfort, to scapegoat or censor, or invalidate those who cause discomfort, rather than understanding the nature of the discomfort. So when I think about going along the road toward becoming a career mathematician, these ideas really stand out all the more as a list of unwritten rules that guide how we train our graduate students. And try as I might, I really can't make sense of why we are so content in doing that. To be revisited. So at this point, I want to start talking and reviewing like who, what, when, where, why, and how of anti-racism in mathematics that I initially put forth earlier this year. And just as sort of a guide, I'm going to motivate each of these 5 W's and how with quoted words of wisdom, not my own, and then provide an intentionally uncomfortable response to each of the questions. So I'm not going to discuss the comfortable responses that you may have heard at my JMM talk, and which also appear on the slides, but I do want to point out that these comfortable responses are often provided as a means of placating and providing comfort to those in power, whereas those lacking power are forced to self-censor. And we need to move beyond this level of censorship in order to make progress. So in thinking about the question of who should be doing anti-racist work, I look to John Lewis's words, which say, ours is not the struggle of one day, 1 week, or 1 year. Ours is the struggle of a lifetime, or maybe even many lifetimes. And each one of us in every generation must do our part. So my response in who should be doing anti-racist work is you, and especially you, if you are white and cisgender. And to quote Robin DiAngelo, racism is a white problem. It was constructed and created by white people, and the ultimate responsibility lies with white people. For too long, we've looked at it as if it were someone else's problem. So if you're white and cisgender, your privilege actually allows you to be the ultimate anti-racist should you choose to take on the task. You may not have anything tangible to gain, but when you, as a white cisgender individual, call out racist practices, ideas, and policies, you center historically excluded voices and experiences in a way that doesn't elicit the same skepticism, resistance, invalidation, and silencing were those same statements made directly by an historically excluded individual. That is your privilege. It takes using your privilege and power to call into question racist ideas, policies, and practices in every single space you inhabit. And whereas I may only be able to speak truth to power, you can actually seek the truth in your own power. How we are being treated within the space of mathematics affects our ability to make it beyond the barriers to inclusion and what we do once we get there. So who is solely responsible for doing this work? I'll tell you who's not your Black colleagues, not your Latinx colleagues, not your Indigenous colleagues, not your Asian American colleagues whom you've managed to simultaneously visibly accept and then subliminally tokenize and other all at once. Racism disproportionately affects those within the BIPOC community, but none of us is without our scars. So no, those should not be the ones who need to lead efforts to fix it. Anti-racism is not a box to be checked, but it's a way of life, a way of being that creates spaces and opportunities for all existing and budding mathematicians to reach their full potential without hindrance from structures that we were born into. So your tokenized colleagues did not create these structures, but often have no choice but to fight them with what little power they have, and often at great cost to their emotional, mental, and physical well-being. So let's not wait for these most disenfranchised individuals to suppress their pain and trauma, push beyond the silencing and gaslighting, and through some combination of undercompensated, underacknowledged, and undeniably exhausting labor, fix a problem that we didn't create, whilst we sit back and judge them for what they haven't accomplished because a racist metric told us to. So progress in and of itself doesn't need to be so difficult, nor does it need to be so painful. So when we think about the what of anti-racist work, Desmond Tutu says, if you are neutral in situations of injustice, you have chosen the side of the oppressor. It is not just about diversity. Diversity is often a blanket term we use when we think it's the right thing to say, but it doesn't just apply to race. And because this isn't a discussion about intersectionality that adds a whole layer or multiple layers of complexity, we have to be a little bit more specific. And specifically, this is about changing and challenging the status quo. What does that mean? That means breaking down all of one's own understanding of how academia and other facets of the mathematical world works. That means identifying how one's own privilege skews this perspective. That means recognizing and addressing evident biases within any space and within anyone. And that also means providing our students with a realistic view of the mathematical world based on the identities that they hold. And I want to say that again, based on the identities that they hold, the students, not our identities. Academia affords us the opportunity to interact with lots of people from various backgrounds, but whether or not we perpetuate a culture of racism and white supremacy is something we can actually be trained to do or not do. That is, holding majority identities while simultaneously choosing to not acknowledge our own privilege trains our students to do exactly the same thing. This is the best way to exponentially perpetuate undesirable qualities within the mathematical community. And indeed, this is how mathematics has operated for centuries. On the other hand, to do the opposite is the best way to shift the paradigm, to redefine success without using our so-called objective metrics that are hopelessly flawed and inherently racist because they fundamentally and disproportionately benefit individuals with white and socioeconomic privilege. We should be making, at all levels of training, from secondary education through postdoctoral work and beyond, we should be making all of those things anti-racist. Our individual perspectives shift at each stage of our careers, and mentors in particular have a responsibility to consider how these shifts depend on intersectionality and our identities. Those with privileged identities might scoff at the work that I've just described, but it doesn't take that much. And the potential benefit of simply having one or two conversations can have a huge impact. And our students don't lose anything, but stand to gain everything. So when we think about when should anti-racist work happen, Audre Lorde says revolution is not a one-time event. So I would say literally yesterday, if possible. Sure, we can say that where the mathematical world is now is better than where it was 20 years ago. And this exact statement was also true 20 years ago and 20 years before that. And it's a terrible excuse for inaction. And if anything, it suggests that we should be doing more. It's time to stop simply talking, to stop engaging in circuitous discourse that ends up nowhere because we're afraid to speak and seek truth, and to do something meaningful, something that's lasting and anti-racist. Let's not wait for the next tragedy before we can act with purpose. Let's also not get so lost in our white supremacy culture of perfectionism that we fail to act at all. Seriously, what are we waiting for? When we think about where, I look again to Angela Davis's words, where she has said, we cannot simply remove names, remove statues, and pretend that after the excision, and perhaps with the addition of a little bit of diversity, that we can continue as we have before. It is the whole that requires critical examination. It is the whole that requires transformation. So my response when asked the question of where this should happen, I will say off the stage, because performative anti-racism is insulting, it's transparent, and not to mention it's racist. And I often, when I think about this, marvel at how many institutions across the nation, both within and beyond higher education, are scrambling to right the wrongs of slavery while simultaneously resisting the actual, not just performative justice that is required to benefit someone other than those already in power. So I ask you to consider the websites of your own institutions, consider the annual poster that each of the big mathematical organizations send out year to year, or emails advertising membership or participation. How many of those institutions have added special pages to their websites with statements about diversity, equity, and inclusion, or compare those images and statements to the actual numbers? How many visually, in terms of the numbers, you see of sort of a diverse representation of mathematicians? How many BIPOC math majors are at your academic institution versus the number of Black, Indigenous, or Latinx students who actually take intro math courses? What are the hiring and retention rates of BIPOC mathematicians in your respective departments, on your teams, versus the attrition rate? How many of these BIPOC mathematicians hold or are promoted to positions that actually have the power to implement policy and structural changes? These are the questions I challenge you to ask within your respective institutions as you work toward being anti-racist. Visibility is important, but it can be misleading if this is the only result of our efforts. It's a safe and it's a neutral response that doesn't actually challenge the status quo at all. And I would be remiss in calling out the role of the very society that sponsors this conference. It's no secret that all mathematical societies have the problem mentioned in my talk title, and arguably none has been perceived as more problematic than the AMS, both historically and currently. And I both acknowledge and do not at all envy the challenging and important work of the AMS's task force on understanding and documenting the historical role of the AMS in racial discrimination, in highlighting and attempting to address the issues that have persisted since the inception of the AMS in the 1880s. But as noted in the task force report, to move beyond this reputation is to analyze every single aspect of an organization, and that requires transformation and to act on it. But even with a list of past and present wrongs comes resistance. And although that's expected, such resistance certainly doesn't do us any favors, and we need to move past that. So because I feel the need to sort of, again, call this out, like there are a few favorite insufficient arguments. There have been some changes since January 6th for not engaging in structural transformation. So one of my favorite, i.e. least favorites, would be, well, at least we're doing something, because that other department or institution or organization isn't even doing that much. And my response to that is, if you thought that way about mathematics, where would the field be? This can't be our criterion. It just can't. Another excuse that comes up is, but it costs money and we don't have the budget for that. And again, my response is simply put that it will always come down to priorities. We put the money where our priorities are. And this is especially true in terms of these larger institutions and organizations. So we can't say that anti-racism is a priority on the website and then avoid putting the necessary resources into taking anti-racist action. This is the myth of what Kendi refers to as not racist neutrality, which is, again, simply put, racist. Another favorite is, but what would others say about this department or institution or organization or our rigors and our standards if we change this policy or practice? And the reality is that when you ask that question, you should be more clear and more transparent about what it is that you actually want to know. It's not a question of what other people would say, but more specifically of what the other upholders of the status quo and performative racial justice would say. And when we're lauded for being exceptional, programs, departments, researchers, educators, we have to be willing to reckon with the sources that are doling out those compliments. Are we exceptional racists or exceptional anti-racist? And I can't answer that question for you, but I can almost guarantee you that there is at least one Black or brown person in your life who actually can. And the other sort of excuse that I've heard is, well, why does the whole field have to change? Can't we just rely on individuals to do what's right? No, we can't. We just can't. Because if we could, we wouldn't be in this mess. And what is right and what is just are two separate things, and they are completely subjective. And so, as I mentioned, structural problems require structural solutions, which have nothing to do with how capable we feel we are of measuring someone else's worth. We shouldn't have that power as individuals, nor as mathematicians, but this is the environment in which we operate. So when you ask the question of where we should target our anti-racist efforts, I invite you to use your own truth, awareness, power, and privilege to consider how racism is manifest in the following spaces and what you can do to combat or dismantle it. That includes things like recruitment, hiring, retention, tenure and promotion, teaching and mentoring both inside and out of the classroom, graduate program admissions and mentoring, professional and your personal networks, whether and department, divisional, or faculty meetings, budgeting, funding, all of these things, conferences, planning, workshops, colloquia, who is invited, who is expected to be there, editing and refereeing journals, the awardees of prizes and fellowships and grants, thinking about appointments and nominations and also voting just for committee and board members, society membership in general, and the benefits that are afforded to those members. And finally, governance structures and organizational bylaws. I have not seen a greater hindrance to any sort of progress except for in this last portion because of maintaining the status quo and keeping in line with history. And if we are to make any sustainable changes, we have to act in all of these spaces and more. This is not an exhaustive list, and yet we can always find additional places of where anti-racist work should be done. The why of it, I hope, is not needed, but I'll humor you anyway. Martin Luther King said, "History will have to record the greatest tragedy of this period of social transition was not the strident clamor of the bad people, but the appalling silence of the good people." So why do anti-racist work? Well, as I said on January 6th, and turns out I was foreshadowing because it was literally 2 hours, if fewer than the attack on the Capitol, no one looks good on the wrong side of history. And also because good intentions, complicit silence, and unintentional harm do not a revolution make. If you seek to be anti-racist and truly seek to be anti-racist, you can't do it from the sidelines. You cannot be silent where you have privilege. Use your privilege in any way, shape, or form that it exists to amplify unheard voices, even when no one is looking, and even if you're the only one saying those things. Because witnessing your individual silence hurts just as much as the loud voices that promote racism. And I understand that I'm challenging you to take off your mathematical hat, put on a socially conscious one. You might say, but that's not my area of expertise. I'm a mathematician, I'm not a sociologist. My response to you is that it's a privilege to be able to make that distinction. Your ability to compartmentalize speaks of privilege. I can't shed my own skin, nor how I'm viewed because of it any more than you can. And the difference is that thanks to an ability to compartmentalize, my skin is often viewed as a threat and can translate everyday occurrences into trauma. So by avoiding anti-racism and hence embracing racism, you are actively hurting me and my fellow tokenized colleagues, whether or not you intend to. And if you're willing to hurt those around you in this way, then the only thing that I can ask of you is that you acknowledge it. Don't try to shy away from it or try to call it something else. Don't make this about you and your skill set and conflate discomfort and lack of knowledge in an anti-racist action with the inability to do difficult things. Because mathematics, like any other STEM field, is notoriously elitist, and tackling difficulty and proving the impossible are badges we wear with pride. So why can't we do this work too? And when we consider the how, Ijeoma Oluo says, the beauty of anti-racism is that you don't have to pretend to be free of racism to be an anti-racist. Anti-racism is the commitment to fight racism wherever you find it, including in yourself, and it's the only way forward. And my response in the how is to not be racist, period, right? So acknowledging it, identifying it, dismantling it. Those are the things that we want to be able to do. To agree with the radical change is not the same as embodying it. And so if you still need to be convinced to engage in anti-racist work, then I would argue that you're content with the racist policies and practices that have benefited you as an individual thus far, which is a fact, not a judgment. So we need to move away from defending intentions and toward acknowledging impact. As an individual, I don't care what you didn't mean to say or do. I do care, however, how it's harmed me. And Kendi's use of racist as a descriptor rather than a pejorative is the best place to start. We can't be afraid or become defensive when our actions are called racist, because our behavior, whether it's action or inaction, actually speaks for itself. And it's merely informative to have an appropriate adjective to describe it. Because once we know better, we can actually choose to do better. We have to question and disrupt the status quo in order to try to create this so-called community that's meant for literally everyone. And a couple of things that we can actually do immediately, for example, would be to evaluate and reimagine any and all current practices and policies that perpetuate white supremacy culture in any way, shape, or form that they exist. And we also need to acknowledge the work and worth of BIPOC folks and to compensate them for their time and energy, regardless of whether you yourself can measure it. Because contrary to popular belief, there is a lot of time and energy that goes into dealing with everyday racism that we do not get to see. And the recovery time and the time for self-care and everything else in the processing time are the things that don't get stated, that don't get seen. And these are things that we need to acknowledge. And so while we excel at making excuses as to why the current policies or standards can't be made anti-racist, we really need to focus on being creative in the solutions that we have to a centuries-old problem so that we can break the cycle. We can't hope to achieve what has never been without doing what has never been done. And so when I think about these sort of 5 W's in how of anti-racism and what that means for graduate education, I have a few thoughts. I mean, I have many thoughts, but these are just a few of them. So the first and foremost thing is that we should be training and graduate anti-racists who also happen to be mathematicians. That should be the goal. What would this mean? This would mean tackling racism and white supremacy culture as a regular part of math education and as a regular part of professional development of our mathematics students. Also, whether holding minority identities or not, graduate students should be exempt from having to do the work that we have been too busy or too short-sighted to do ourselves. What's more is that graduate students have even less power to do anything with the possible penalty of a career at stake. They have more important things to do like coursework, independent study, qualifying exams, writing dissertations, getting jobs, and maybe even publishing papers. But at the same time, I will say that no adult, this includes graduate students, should be exempt from introspection and self-awareness. The caveat to this is the following. To graduate students who hold majority identities, please do your internal work. Acknowledge and analyze your power and privilege. Identify and combat your own racist behaviors and thoughts. Be anti-racist even if you can't convince others to be, because your future students and colleagues will thank you for it later. In addition to all of that, I have to say that graduate students, in my opinion, are one of the most exploited populations in the mathematical community. Depending on the institution, we burden our graduate students with the task of teaching dozens, if not hundreds of students each semester. We structure our programs so that in addition to bridging the wide gap between undergraduate and graduate mathematics training, we impose the responsibility of educating post-secondary students, many of whom have already been jaded by mathematics and are arguably the most challenging to teach. We perpetuate a cycle of math phobia, which in essence translates into elitism by not prioritizing education. And to add insult to injury, we undercompensate our graduate students under the assumption that their only responsibility is as a graduate student in our program. In the same way that we under-acknowledge the outside responsibility that many of our first-gen low-income students have beyond mathematics, we create a system that disproportionately benefits those with varying degrees of privilege, making the so-called ivory tower even more inaccessible to even the most passionate of young mathematicians. And further, without training our graduate students in the nuances of mathematical culture, we are subjecting our BIPOC students in particular to an environment in which their presence and authority is subliminally and in many cases explicitly called into question without any sense of agency or recourse. We simply put, have to do better. The other thing that I have to say, told you I had a lot of things to say, is that power does not equal respect. Those of us with those three letters behind our names somehow believe that we're warranted respect by everyone. And I've always heard that respect must be earned. It doesn't come for free. While we disenfranchise graduate students, putting them in the most vulnerable of positions, as I mentioned before, wherein there's no recourse to right wrongs done to them, we expect that if they want to succeed, they must swallow the pain they experience for fear of failure, even before they begin their careers. We take this vulnerable population of mathematicians, put them into subhuman boxes and experiment with their lives to see how they fare. We exert the little power we have over a less powerful population, almost as a way of validating the experiences we have had ourselves as graduate students. And to be clear, I had a fantastic time in graduate school. I mean, it was hard and I wanted to quit at times. I mean, but that's like normal. But on the whole, my experience was a positive one. And on the other hand, I've witnessed and heard too many horror stories to believe that my experience is actually the norm. And the question I ask is, why can't that be the norm? What is it about mathematics that forces us to create the kind of suffocating environment that requires our students to lose the best part of themselves, all in an effort to earn a graduate degree? And finally, I want to say a little bit about our need to reevaluate tradition and what that means. Because when we say, well, that's how it's always been done, we fall victim to complacency. We rationalize harm because no one has been bold enough or had enough power to do something differently. We can't rely on our own experiences to guide what we do for the next generation. The world around us changes every single day, and our chokehold on tradition blinds us from the progress and the transformation that can actually happen by thinking creatively and holistically, rather than with an individualized mindset. Why should we want future generations of mathematicians to endure the pain that we have had to endure? What does anyone gain from that? I would argue that we didn't become better mathematicians, we just learned how to ignore the world and rely only on ourselves to accomplish what we set out to do. It's a privilege to be in that position, because when the world around you is structured to be at odds with your very identity, you don't get to ignore it, plain and simple. So what can we do? Well, I have some thoughts about that too. But to think about our discomfort and also what transformations can be made when we step into the discomfort and out of what is comfortable. So I have a description of discomfort that I would like you to sort of think about as we, theorize what we could do in providing some perspective on the problem. So the benefit of working for myself personally at a small liberal arts college is the progressive nature of the discussions surrounding race, class, diversity, equity, and inclusion. The trauma of working at a small liberal arts college is the harmful nature of these very discussions for folks who hold marginalized identities. As payment for validating our calls for an anti-racist overhaul of the institution, academic spaces, and the associated policies and practices, we are asked to put our trauma on display. And with a stock Hallmark-esque promise to do better, we are gaslighted, ignored, censored, and otherwise silenced. Also that the institution can remain with its feet solidly planted in the racist framework on which it was built. Then, while patting itself on the back for altruistically providing the few disenfranchised souls an opportunity to voice their concerns, it can be reassured that it isn't as bad as those other less evolved places that would never even have such open and honest conversations. It doles out empty hope to the hopeless, whose stories fall on deaf ears, and reopens wounds that have barely begun to clot. Finally, under the guise of logistics, budget, and bureaucracy, but with a firm commitment to create space for everyone, the institution can safely uphold its racist system of oppression. Of course, the institution finds a more palatable way of doing this, throwing in a token announcement or a photo or perhaps an apology on the website for good measure. But the end result is the same. Add quote unquote diversity, hear all the ways it's not working, and keep the fundamentally racist structure intact. Then throw one's hands in the air when BIPOC recruitment and retention is low. If you haven't already guessed, this is also how the mathematical world works too. So I want to leave you with a quotation by Toni Morrison, who says, if you are free, then you need to free somebody else. If you have some power, then it is your job to empower somebody else. If we are able to operate in this vein, we might actually have a hope of addressing our problem in mathematics and shifting the paradigm, no matter how uncomfortable it is. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that phenomenal talk. That was just wonderful. There are a bunch of questions in the Slido. So I'll just go ahead and turn to those if that's okay.
Sure.
So one of the questions is sort of related to this end part, discussing graduate students, and that of course they have a role to play in this, but they're also some of the most exploited folks in our sort of math community. And so one of the questions is, what are some ways to reduce graduate student exploitation? And I think I would like to ask sort of specifically sort of in the frame of introducing and initiating these sort of anti-racist work within the department.
So I think there's two parts to that. In order to reduce the exploitation of graduate students, we have to put funding where it's needed. We have to pay our graduate students more. We need to focus on training our graduate students. I mean, many of us who are in academia, or many of us who just go through mathematics graduate programs or mathematical science graduate programs are not trained to do half of what we do, right? And a lot of that boils down to teaching and training students. We are not trained to do that, and we should be. And so I think that there's sort of a two-part piece to this, which is that we have to do the work ourselves in order to make sure that our graduate students have the appropriate tools to do it. But we also, in order to sort of reduce some of the exploitation and afford graduate students a little bit more agency, we need to, one, pay them more, make sure that there are avenues for recourse that don't explicitly harm their career prospects. And I mean, I think that in and of itself is sort of the biggest one, but it comes down to money, it comes down to priorities, it comes down to having the appropriate training and the desire to do better.
Awesome, thank you for that response. I want to sort of tie into the idea of what do we need to do? We need to put our money where our mouth is. And one of the things that you mentioned as a hindrance to sort of doing this work within a department is sort of governance structures and bylaws. And so there's a question here, anonymous question. It says, you mentioned governance structures and bylaws being a particular hindrance in doing anti-racist work. Are there specific examples of this that come to mind?
I have a lot that I probably shouldn't say, but what I will say is, I mean, one could argue that this entire talk has already been made political, so I'll use a political argument. We see how our current government works and where the issues are with actually getting anything done. And a lot of the rules that form how government operates are also adopted by institutions of higher education. Now, I can't speak for institutions other than my own in terms of the precise sort of functionality and where the power lies, but wherever the power lies is where the issues are. And so if the power lies in who has control in terms of the governance structure, then that is the thing that needs to sort of be overhauled. And so I think that there are many ways in which that plays out, and it's difficult to attach a comprehensive view of that if you are not in that setting, right? So I would say just go review the bylaws and the governance structure for any institution that you are at and see if any of that makes sense to you, because it doesn't to me, especially when it comes down to actually getting effective change done and implemented. But again, I can only speak from my personal experience, but at the same time, I suspect that is a big roadblock when it comes to trying to get things done.
Okay, so I'm going to sort of tie together two of the questions that are in the Slido, because I think they're sort of coming opposite sides of the same coin. So one of them is anonymous. Have you come up with effective strategies for having conversations with your colleagues about initiating anti-racist work within your department? And then the second one that I'd like to tie it to is a question from Piper H, which is very upvoted, which is, if a department is racist, should anti-racist faculty push the language of anti-racism, and then in parentheses, gaslighting POC, or push transparency, discouraging POC?
Okay, so the first question about tools. It is not easy to speak truth to power. And in the ways that you are most comfortable doing that are the things that you should attempt. So for me, what that means is drafting emails, writing letters, setting up meetings, talking to different people and just being like, hey, this is a problem and here's why. That doesn't work for everybody. Sometimes you need allies. You need someone who is trustworthy, whether it's within your department or outside of your department, to advocate for you. And those people have to be identified by you as an individual. They can't be self-identified as allies, because we all know how that goes. And I think that it's not an easy task. And I don't recommend that, depending on your level of vulnerability, that it's something that you should undertake either. I think that you have to sort of weigh what you are not willing to, but in a sort of healthy way, what you can stand and what you can't, and then act accordingly. And as far as the question of vehemently racist departments, I think I missed the last part of the question, which was about anti-racist colleagues.
Yeah, so the second question is just from Piper H about like,
Yep.
if your department is racist, should we? And then the first question was just about having those conversations.
So if your department is racist, what do you do about it?
Oh yeah, like do you try to push this sort of language of anti-racism, which can end up feeling like you're sort of gaslighting a lot of the people of color in the department, since they're still experiencing the racism of the department and that's not changing? Or should you be sort of pushing for transparency, which then is going to be extremely discouraging for the people of color in the department to sort of see what it really is that that department sort of has?
I mean, the very fact that this question is asked means that there is no nice answer here. So I have a couple of thoughts on that. One thought is that when you push the language of anti-racism right out the gate, you're going to hit a wall of defensiveness. And you have to be prepared for that. I also, in my experience, have found that the more these issues come up and the more, the worse the outside world gets, the easier it is to bring these ideas into a department. That doesn't mean that change will happen at all. It is a very slow process that, again, from my perspective, has taken years to even get a little bit of headway. So I think that, you know, you kind of have to toe this weird line of it's the comfort discomfort, right? So I'm not above making people uncomfortable, but I also have to acknowledge that how I do that and the timing in which I do that is going to affect what can be done. And so right out the gate, I'd be like, these things are fundamentally wrong because X, Y, and Z. And then maybe the next time it'd be like, oh, by the way, when I said that they're fundamentally wrong, I actually meant that they were racist. And then, oh, when I said that they were racist, that means that you should actually do something about it. But it's like priming, right? Like it's the vaccine. You need to poke and prod at every little bit, and then eventually it will take. It may not take a lot, but it will take a little bit. But the other thing is having allies. I cannot stress that enough. And unfortunately, it is very difficult to find allies. You can sort of, I mean, I see a lot of people nodding their heads. You're like, I'm trying. And I wish this person were an ally, but they are not. And they think that they are, and they're not. And it's not helpful, right? And so I think that you kind of have to look at who is around you and who can be in your corner and who is in a position of privilege to say the things that you can't actually say. Because if you do say them, they're going to be immediately discounted. That doesn't mean that you shouldn't say them, but that means that you have to be prepared that whatever comes out of your mouth, unless it is, let's see what the words are, articulate or well said or all of the things, if that's, we all know what those mean, right? And so I think that having and identifying an ally, and on the other hand, if you think you are an ally, ask somebody around you who is from a marginalized group whether you actually are an ally or not. That's all I'm going to say about that.
Okay, great. I especially like the comment about, if you think you're an ally, maybe do some groundwork to check if you're actually in alliance with any of the people that you claim to be. Okay, so another sort of, I think we have time for maybe another question, and then we'll sort of, I'll make just a couple announcements, and then I think we can make the shift to breakout rooms. But for this last question, it's also sort of more upvoted here on Slido, which is from David Jekyll asking, How do we balance the need for cis het white people to step up and combat racism versus the need to center marginalized groups and give them power and control?
If we have the opportunities for people from minoritized groups and who hold marginalized identities to actually have power to make change, they are going to do the work regardless. But the idea is that we shouldn't rely on them to do that work, right? So the reality is that we need folks from who hold majority identities to do some of that footwork, because the perception of anti-racism coming from someone who doesn't look like me is a lot more palatable than coming from someone who looks like me. And that's the reality. And so it's not that folks, Black and brown folks and the folks from other marginalized communities shouldn't be doing the work. It's that they shouldn't be the only ones doing the work, and it should be their choice. And a lot of times it's not a choice. It's about survival.